The funeral was on a Thursday. It rained the whole day, the kind of rain that feels like the sky is grieving with you. 300 people stood in that cemetery with black umbrellas, watching a small white coffin being lowered into the ground. The boy inside was 9 years old. His name was Danny. His mother, Helen, had to be held up by two people because her legs kept giving out. His father, Ray, stood completely still, dry-eyed, because he had already cried for so many days that his body had simply run out. The pastor said the words. The coffin went down, the dirt covered it, and everyone went home and tried to figure out how to live with a hole that size in the middle of their lives. For 7 years, they carried that hole. For 7 years, Helen lit a candle on Danny's birthday and talked to a photograph. For 7 years, Ray drove past the elementary school every morning and gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in November, no warning, no phone call, no explanation, someone knocked on the front door of their house. Ray opened it, and the boy who had been buried in that cemetery 7 years ago was standing on the porch, older, thinner, scarred in ways that had nothing to do with the body, but alive. And what came next, what Danny told them, and what it meant, was going to change everything. Because Danny hadn't died. He had been sold, and the man who sold him had been standing at that funeral. Let me take you back, because you need to understand this family before you understand what was done to them. Ray and Helen Marsh were the kind of couple that other couples quietly pointed to as proof that good marriages still existed. Ray worked in logistics management, not glamorous but solid and honest. Helen was a part-time librarian who knew the name of every child who walked through her doors. They lived in a mid-sized town called Crestfield, in a house with a porch swing and a vegetable garden, and a dog named Pepper, who slept at the foot of Danny's bed every night. Danny was their only child, not for lack of trying. There had been 2 miscarriages before him, and after him the doctor said no more. So everything they had, all of it, went into that boy. Not in a suffocating way, in the way that parents love when they understand what a miracle looks like. Danny was 9 years old, and he was one of those kids who makes you believe the world is going to be fine. Curious about everything, laughed too loud, collected rocks from every place he visited, tried to teach Pepper to shake hands for 2 straight months until the dog finally gave in just to get some peace. The day he disappeared started like every other day. A Friday in September. School let out at 3. Danny always walked home. It was 6 blocks, a route he knew by heart. He'd done it 100 times. He never arrived. By 4 o'clock, Helen was at the school. By 5, Ray had driven every block between there and home. By 6, the police were involved. By midnight, Crestfield was in full search mode. Neighbors, volunteers, flashlights moving through every park and alley and stretch of woods within 5 miles. They found nothing. For 3 weeks, they found nothing. And then on a cold October morning, a sheriff's deputy called Ray and said they'd recovered a body from the river 12 miles outside town. The body of a boy, consistent with Danny's description. The official identification process was a nightmare of its own. The condition of the body made it difficult. The family was in such a state of shock and grief that the process moved quickly, perhaps too quickly, driven by the desperate human need to have an answer. Any answer, rather than keep living in the unbearable space of not knowing. They buried their son. They built a life around the grave. And the real Danny was somewhere else entirely, learning to survive in a world that had swallowed him whole. Now, the antagonist. His name was Pastor Lewis Carroll. And if you'd lived in Crestfield, you would have trusted him with your life. Lewis Carroll had led the Crestfield Community Church for 19 years. Silver-haired, warm-voiced, always the first to arrive at a hospital bedside and the last to leave a grieving family's home. He'd officiated 200 funerals, married half the town, baptized their children. He ran a youth outreach program. He sat on the school board. He had a handshake that made you feel like everything was going to be okay. He delivered Danny's eulogy himself. He stood at that pulpit with tears in his eyes, real-looking tears, the kind that a certain type of person can manufacture on demand. And he spoke about the fragility of life and the grace of God and what a light Danny Marsh had been in this community. Ray held Helen's hand in the front pew and thought, at least we have this. At least we have people like Lewis who actually loved our boy. He had no idea. The 7 years after the funeral were quiet in the way that grief makes everything quiet. Helen went back to the library after 8 months. She needed the routine. She needed the children. Their noise, their questions, the way they made the building feel alive. She never stopped lighting the candle on Danny's birthday. She never took his name off her phone contacts. She couldn't explain why. It just felt like deleting it would be the final thing, the real ending, and she wasn't ready for that. Ray went the other direction. He got quieter, more internal. He ran 5 miles every morning before dawn in a way that had nothing to do with fitness and everything to do with needing to move. Needing the body to be doing something while the mind stayed in a place he couldn't escape. They stayed together, which was more than many couples manage after losing a child. But they were held together now by shared damage as much as by love, and both of them knew the difference. The only person who checked on them consistently, reliably, every single week without fail, was Pastor Lewis Carroll. He came for dinner at least once a month. He called every Sunday. When Helen had a breakdown on the 3rd anniversary of Danny's death, just sat down on the kitchen floor and couldn't get up, it was Lewis who came over and sat on the floor with her and stayed until Ray got home. They trusted him completely. They had no idea they were trusting the man who destroyed them. Now, Danny, let me tell you where he actually was. Because this story only works if you understand what survival looks like when you're 9 years old and the world has done its worst to you. The night Danny disappeared, he hadn't been taken by a stranger. He'd been approached on his walk home by a man he vaguely recognized. Someone connected to the church youth program, someone whose face he'd seen enough times not to feel alarm. The man said there was a problem, that Danny's parents had asked him to pick Danny up. He had a phone showing what looked like a message from Ray's number. Danny got in the car. He was driven 4 hours away, handed off, and entered a trafficking network that moved children across state lines under the cover of various false fronts. Group homes, labor programs, informal work arrangements in rural communities far from anywhere Danny had ever been. He spent the next 7 years in 3 different states. He learned very quickly that crying didn't help, that asking for help from the wrong person made things worse, that the only way through was to stay quiet, stay useful, stay invisible, and wait. He was not passive. He was strategic. Even at 9, 10, 11 years old, Danny Marsh was watching, memorizing faces, understanding systems, learning who answered to whom and why. By the time he was 16, he had pieced together enough of the network to understand that his entry point, the first handoff, the first transaction, had originated from someone in Crestfield. Someone with access to families, with trust, with cover. Someone who knew exactly which children were isolated enough, which families were distracted enough, which moments were unguarded enough. It took Danny another year to get out. I won't spend too long here because the details are dark, and the point is that he did it. He got out, found a social worker in a county office 3 states away who actually listened and started the long process of proving who he was. The DNA test took 6 weeks. The call to Crestfield took 6 more to arrange because no one believed it at first. Because there was a death record. Because there was a grave. And then one Tuesday evening in November, a car pulled up outside 414 Elm Street in Crestfield, and Danny Marsh, 16 years old, 5'8", carrying nothing but a backpack and 7 years of memories that would take decades to process, walked up the porch steps and knocked on the door. Ray opened the door. He stared. He didn't speak for what felt like a full minute. His brain was doing something it couldn't quite complete, like a computer trying to run a program it doesn't have the language for. Danny said, "Dad." That was the word that broke it. Ray made a sound that Helen would later describe as something she had never heard from another human being and hoped never to hear again. Not quite a cry, not quite a shout. Something from a deeper place than either of those. He grabbed his son. Helen came running from the kitchen and stopped in the hallway doorway and looked at the two of them, and her legs did the same thing they'd done at the cemetery 7 years ago. They simply stopped working. She went down, but this time Ray caught her, and Danny caught her, and all 3 of them ended up on the floor of the entryway, just holding each other. Pepper, mine, Marie. old now, gray around the muzzle, came padding out from the living room, sniffed Danny once, and then lay down across all three of them like he was keeping them in place. The police came eventually, social workers, a victim advocate. The house filled up with people and procedures and necessary official things that none of them had any energy for. But through all of it, Danny sat at the kitchen table. His kitchen table, the one with the chip in the corner from when he dropped a toy truck on it at age 6. And he answered every question carefully, clearly, and with a composure that broke every professional in that room, because no 16-year-old should have that kind of composure. It meant he'd learned it the hard way. And when they asked him about the beginning, about the night he disappeared, about the man who picked him up, Danny described the face as clearly as if he'd been looking at a photograph. The detective across from him, a woman named Claire Okafor, who had 20 years on the job, went very still. "Can you describe this person again?" she said, carefully, professionally. Danny described him again. Claire Okafor set down her pen. She knew that face. Everyone in Crestfield knew that face. The investigation moved quickly once Danny's account was officially on record. What the detectives uncovered over the following 3 weeks was not a simple story. It was a system. And Lewis Carroll hadn't just been a peripheral player in it. He had been, for at least a decade, one of its most reliable and trusted sources. The community church gave him access. The youth outreach program gave him files, names, family situations, which children were in unstable homes, which parents were overwhelmed, which kids walked routes alone. He knew the rhythms of the town better than anyone. He knew which families were too ashamed to make noise, which ones could be convinced that a missing child had simply run away, which ones were so deep in grief that they'd accept an identification that wasn't quite right because the alternative, the not knowing, was unbearable. He had done this before Danny. The investigators found 2 other cases, children who had disappeared from Crestfield in the decade prior, cases that had gone cold, runaways officially, accidents, one presumed drowning. Lewis Carroll had attended every memorial. He had comforted every family. He had, in at least 2 instances, suggested to investigators early in the process that the child in question had mentioned running away, had seemed troubled, had been difficult. Small seeds of misdirection planted with such gentle, credible authority that no one had questioned them. The financial trail took longer, but it was there. Payments routed through a series of shell accounts into a fund that nominally supported overseas mission work. 19 years of community trust, 19 years of cover. The morning the arrest warrant was signed, Claire Okafor drove to the church herself. Lewis Carroll was in his office preparing Sunday's sermon. He looked up when she walked in, and for just a fraction of a second, before the mask came back, something crossed his face. Not surprise, recognition. The look of a man who has known this moment was coming and has been managing the waiting. "Detective," he said. "Lewis Carroll," she said. "You're under arrest." He stood slowly, smoothed his jacket, and said nothing else. The town of Crestfield found out by noon. The reaction in Crestfield was the kind of collective shock that rewires a community permanently. Because this wasn't a stranger. This wasn't someone who'd slipped through the cracks. This was the man people had called when their marriages were in trouble, when their parents were dying, when they needed someone to tell them it was going to be okay. He had sat at Ray and Helen's table. He had held Helen on their kitchen floor. He had stood at Danny's grave, Danny's empty grave, and wept. Ray drove to the cemetery the afternoon of the arrest. He stood at the headstone, his son's name carved into it, the dates, the little engraved bird that Helen had chosen because Danny used to chase pigeons in the park. And he stood there for a long time. He didn't cry. He'd done all that crying already. He just stood there looking at a grave that should never have existed. Next to a stone that marked a child who was alive and sitting in their house eating cereal and watching TV and slowly, carefully beginning the enormous work of becoming a person again. Then he drove home. The trial was 8 months later. The prosecution's case was extensive. Danny's testimony, financial records, 2 other survivors who had been located through the investigation, now adults, who came forward once Carroll was arrested. Digital evidence recovered from devices in his church office. Lewis Carroll's defense tried several angles. Character witnesses, and there were many, because 19 years of goodwill doesn't evaporate overnight for everyone. Claims of misidentification, questions about memory reliability and trafficking survivors. None of it held. Danny testified for 3 hours. He sat in that witness box, composed, clear, specific, and described the night he was taken, the man who took him, and the years that followed with a precision that left no room for doubt. At no point did he raise his voice. At no point did he break down. He answered every question from the defense with the patience of someone who has been waiting a very long time for this room and is not going to waste it. Lewis Carroll sat at the defense table and did not look at Danny once during those 3 hours. Helen watched from the gallery, Ray's hand in hers. At one point, the defense attorney asked Danny, "After 7 years, how can you be certain about what you saw that night?" Danny looked at him steadily. "Because," he said, "when you're 9 years old and a man puts you in a car and drives you away from your life, you memorize his face. You memorize everything about him. Because someday, you tell yourself someday, it's going to matter." The courtroom was silent. "It mattered," Danny said. Lewis Carroll received 32 years, federal trafficking charges, multiple counts, plus state charges related to the 2 additional cases. The judge in sentencing said, "You used the trust this community placed in you as a weapon against the most vulnerable people within it. There is no more complete betrayal of a position of care." Carroll was taken from the courtroom without looking at anyone. Outside in the courthouse steps, a crowd had gathered. Not violent, not loud, just present. Crestfield trying to process what it had learned about itself and the man it had loved. Ray and Helen came out with Danny between them. Someone in the crowd started to clap, then someone else, then more. Not the triumphant kind of applause, the kind that means, "We see you. We're sorry. We're glad you're here." Danny looked out at all those faces, faces of a town that had grieved him, buried him, let him go, and he nodded once. A small, quiet acknowledgement. The headstone came down on a Saturday in April. Ray had organized it quietly. Just the family, Claire Okafor and one other person, an older man named Stuart, who'd been Danny's 4th grade teacher and who had never quite stopped wondering. They removed the stone, filled in the plot, planted grass. Helen had wanted to do something to mark it. Not grief, but something else. She'd planted a small rose bush at the edge of the plot, something living, something that required tending. Danny had stood watching the whole process with his hands in his pockets. Afterward, he crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the fresh earth for a moment. Not sad exactly, just acknowledging. Saying something wordless to the version of himself that the world had given up on. Then he stood up, put his hands back in his pockets and said, "Can we get breakfast? I've been thinking about that diner on 4th Street for 7 years. Ray laughed. Actually laughed. The real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere that had been locked up for a long time. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." Recovery was not a straight line. Nobody pretended it was. Danny had a therapist he spoke to twice a week. A quiet man named Dr. Evan Cole, who understood that healing at 16, after what Danny had been through, was going to be its own long journey, and who never once tried to rush it. There were nights Danny couldn't sleep. There were days Helen watched him from across the room and had to resist the urge to keep touching his arm just to confirm he was real. There were conversations that started and stopped and needed to wait for the right moment. But there were also ordinary things. Danny re-enrolled in school, 2 grades behind, which required some adjustment, but he was sharp in ways that formal education couldn't measure, and he made up ground fast. He got his own phone. He rediscovered that he still loved rocks, still picked them up from interesting places, still examined them with the same focused attention he'd had at 9. He taught Pepper a new trick. It only took 3 weeks this time. He and Ray started running together in the mornings, not for any reason either of them stated out loud. Just because it turned out they both needed to move, and it was better to move together. On the first birthday after Danny came home, his 17th, Helen made the same cake she'd made every year since he disappeared. Devil's food, chocolate frosting, his name in the same blue icing. Every year for 7 years she'd made it and cried over it, and then quietly thrown most of it away. This year she put 17 candles on it and called him to the kitchen. Danny stood in front of the cake and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his mother, then his father, then back at the cake. "You made this every year?"